Welcome to the panel room. This show is about mapping the imaginary realms. And before we get started, though, let's go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves and a little bit about how you use maps in your work. And we'll start with you, Jeanne.
Oh, okay. I'm Jeanne Adams. I write paranormal romantic suspense, urban fantasy, and space adventure with my friend Nancy Northcott. And I love maps, and I use maps to draw my imaginary town in Massachusetts and lay it out so I know where the turns are if I have to drive somewhere in my character's head. I use maps to map the planet that Nancy and I created together in the star system and all sorts of other things. And yeah, I use them all the time. I love them.
All right, perfect. Tina?
I'm Tina LeCount Myers. I am the author of the Legacy of the Heavens series. It's a trilogy. The last book just came out at the beginning of the pandemic, right before it. So that was a thrilling year. And I have to say, I will probably say the most controversial things about maps, even though I love maps. I love cartography. I'm a historian. But I had some really strong feelings about not having maps in my books, and I had to eat every one of those words. So I'm sure we'll have some hate coming my way, but I will be that person for today, I guess.
All right, perfect. Susan?
I am Susan Roddey. I write dark fantasy and horror as S.H. Roddey, and then I also write both paranormal and contemporary romance as Siobhan Kincaid. My use of maps comes from the fact that I am severely ADHD, and the squirrels in my head will not allow me to keep a train of thought long enough to get it on paper. So I tend to draw everything out with arrows and notes, and it doesn't matter how big it is, how little it is, if it's a real place or not. There's usually a map somewhere in my research for it because I can't remember anything.
All right, perfect. And finally, Kat?
Hi, I am Kat Scully. I'm the author and illustrator of the book series Jennifer Strange, which debuted during the pandemic. I got my start in the publishing industry by being a map illustrator. My first world map was Winter Spell by Claire Legrand with Simon Schuster, and since then I've worked on world maps for Random House, HarperCollins, Macmillan, pretty much every one of the publishing houses I've done a world map for at this point. And I've also done world maps for film concept art and video games now. So I also work as a game developer for the Deep End Games. I do their world maps, their iconography, their logo, all of the fun graphic designy stuff. So I'm always the one who's helping the writer develop their finished map and dealing with printing it, also with giveaways of maps. So I've done so many. I'm really excited to be on this panel and talk about it and all the different experiences of what it's like to be the writer and the illustrator having a map.
All right, perfect. So I'll start the next question with you, Tina. Whether you, and this kind of leads into what you were saying, what does having a map do for you as a writer, whether you publish it or not?
Well, I mean, I think I started writing this series 10 years ago, and it was just for myself, it was going to be fun. And I knew where this place was located. It's kind of located in the real world, and that it's set in the Arctic tundra, kind of the upper regions of Scandinavia. So I had a real place in mind that was fairly otherworldly. And I just started writing because I knew what it looked like. And then I realized, oh, wait a second. No, actually, I don't know. And like Susan had mentioned earlier, and Jeanne as well, I need to know which direction they're coming from, and I need to know where they're going to. And suddenly the idea of not having a map was just completely, I felt like an idiot. Like, why didn't I have a map right from the beginning? So by the time I'm having a publishing contract, I'm having to come up with a map, because in my head, I know where everything's kind of going, but I actually need to now make sure that I'm not contradicting myself. I'm not putting things in the wrong place. So it had to do about continuity. And it was like one of these crazy rookie mistakes that I made. And I swear that was the first thing I should have done. I should have drawn a map, and I didn't. And I don't know why I have this sort of averseness to maps, even though I love them and use them and rely on them. I'm a navigator in our family. Like, my husband cannot navigate at all. I am the navigator. I use the map. I have good sense of direction, but there is this strange reaction that I have, like sort of a knee-jerk reaction, which may come from so much of the Tolkien sort of versions, like retold versions of Tolkien that came out, that everyone had a map, and I'm like, oh, stop with the maps. But actually, I needed to start with a map, so I blew it, and I've learned my lesson. I learned it hard.
All right, Susan?
Okay, so like I said, a lot with me, a lot of it is the function of the ADHD neurosis. I have to be able to, I'm a very visual person, and I have to be able to see what's going on in order to make it make sense in my head. A lot of the time, the little fictional towns and things that I've built are based on real places or in real places. For example, one of the towns that I use is set in Colleton County, South Carolina, which is basically a giant swamp. There's not a whole lot between Charleston and Walterboro in that area. And this little town that I have sits right there. So I've got everything drawn out as to where it sits in accordance with the major highways and the other towns that are there and all the streets. And there's a whole history to the town. So I had to have the map. And well, it's also a good way for me to procrastinate. I'm really good at not doing the writing part because I'd rather, Melissa MacArthur from Falstaff, she calls it vacuuming the cat. And I'll tell you right now, none of the cats in my stories have any hair left, and I'm working on the skin. But it does. It helps me visualize what's going on, and then when I forget what I'm doing, I look back and go, "Oh, right, that's where we were." But I can also say, with what Tina was talking about with maps in every single book, as a book formatter, I can tell you that maps are the bane of my existence. I absolutely hate formatting a book that has maps in it because they never fit on the page. They never work the right way, particularly in ebooks. Trying to format a map in an ebook, I would rather shave my head and paint it with honey, go stand under a bee's nest. It is there. I love the maps. They're beautiful. They're necessary. I need them. From a technical standpoint, I want them all to I want to kill them all with fire. So.
And the important part always falls right in the crease. Yeah.
Yes, and when you tell an author, "Oh, well, I'm going to have to cut your map in half," no, okay, then we get rid of it. But we have to have it. No, thank you.
All right, Kat, since you're also an illustrator, how does that impact everything for you?
So I agree with everything Susan just said, from the pain that is formatting a map over 2 pages in the crease. And as an illustrator and designer, I understand it falls in, but the author wants certain things in the very center. All the important stuff's always in the very center. And I can't put font in the center of the map. So that's always interesting to go, okay, whenever I sketch a map, I always show it with the bleeds, which is where everything gets cut off, where the center fold is, so they understand this is not, it's a physical 3D thing. You're no longer mapping a map for your book, you are developing something 3-dimensional. So it's not going to fall the same way as it does in your story. So we're going to have to move it away from the crease, or you're just not going to be able to read it. My process for helping just other like authors is very different from developing my own maps. I have the same process as Susan. I am very visual. I also have ADHD. So everything has to have exactly what the plot point is in that location. I get a whiteboard, I write out and draw the entire area because I am an illustrator, so I could just draw it and go, hey, this is where in Savannah, Georgia, and Jennifer Strange is going to take place on this street, and then on this block, and on this square. And I mapped out everything beat for beat in the story visually. And so when I went about making the map for Jennifer Strange, 1, it was absolutely a pain because most of it falls in the center crease. And 2, because I knew where everything was and I wanted it to look a certain way, but it was so fast because I'd done so many maps at that point. I just like drew it and knew how to lay it out so that it would work as a physical thing, not just a piece of art. And it's just, maps are so interesting. Every single one is different. I don't use the same process every time. It depends on what the story is. If it's fantasy, if it's science fiction, if it's contemporary, like usually horror maps are contemporary maps, really. I mean, like in Jennifer Strange, it's a map of Savannah, Georgia. In book 2, it's going to be a map of a house, a giant house. So it's like a real space. But when you're dealing with fantasy, there's the whole question of what's the border? What's the compass rose? Do we want to put Easter eggs about the story in it? How much of a hint is too much of a hint? So when I get to have full control of my art, I know all those answers, but when I work with authors, they don't always know those answers of what embellishments do you want? How much detail? How many trees? Do you want trees? Do you not want trees? Do you want mountains really detailed? Do you not? So that's something I help authors work through when they work with me.
Perfect. Jeannie.
That is so fascinating. I had never thought about adding Easter eggs in the map.
Yeah.
So now I have a whole new idea. You may have just done something very bad there, Kat.
I'm being a bad influence.
Yeah, you are. I don't have ADHD, but I love to draw maps, and I have an architecture design degree, and I love to know where things are in space because, as everybody said, I'm also very visual. And for me, the story tends to roll out in my head like a film. So for me, making sure I know the blocking in a scene, like a house, or like one of the series I do, I'm in an anthology and it's set in a castle on the Welsh Marches. Well, we made this castle out of thin air. It's a combination of a couple existing castles, but we sort of made rooms and created things for the uses of the story. And somebody said, does anybody know how to draw? I'm like, oh yeah, I guess that's my job. But that was actually literally the only way to keep 7 authors from creating spaces that probably can't exist in space. So that's the way I use it, is both for that. And also, Tina, I had to laugh because I wrote a book and had to write the maps later and create the maps later. And I will never do that again. For the continuity reason you talked about, because I had to go back and literally read every single word of the first book and think, I actually had to go and solve that and like reissue the first book, because there were some places that you can't turn that way in Washington, D.C. It's a one-way street. So, and that my first urban fantasy set in D.C. and I'm like, freaking one-way streets. I hate those things. But yeah, that's, I mean, I use it pretty much now because I learned my lesson at all stages of the story. And a lot of it is just for continuity and to keep my brain on track. Did I answer the question or did I just ramble?
No, you got it. So my next question is, and Kat kind of touched on this, but I'm going to start with you, Susan. What's your process when you start making a map? That could be the tools you use. Where do you start? Do you start with the real map and then edit?
Well, it really depends on the story. If it's something that is set in a real place, I'm actually from Charleston, South Carolina. So a lot of my stuff is set in the Low Country because that's where I grew up. That's what I know. When I've got events that are going on in real places, Charleston, Savannah, Walterboro, Savannah, Somerville, all those, I will go out and I will swipe the Google map and then things are moving, mark it up as I need to, add in my notes, things like that. And in the case of, like I said, Monarch's Crossing, with it being built in a swamp area, I took the real map, figured out how much space I had, and then made my town fit within the confines of that swampy area where it could not possibly really exist because, again, it's just water and cypress trees. But if it's something a little more in-depth, if it is a completely fictional area, something more toward that dark fantasy or romantic fantasy type deal, I start with a piece of really big graph paper that I use for mapping in D&D and kind of sketch out the borders and the boundaries and general ideas. And then as the story progresses, I add the details in as I go, because a lot of times I'll go back and change things, move stuff around. Oh, this town can't be here. It's got to be way over there. you know, it's very rare that I do things like this in Photoshop or on the computer at all, because I change my mind way too much, and it's a lot easier to erase with a pencil than try to make my clumsy hands work with what's on the screen. So does that answer the question?
Mhm.
I kind of got
Definitely.
lost there for a minute.
No, that's good. Kat, with you, it's even, I think, might be more interesting in the sense that you have 3 different ways to start a map, because you've got it as the writer, as illustrator, and game design. Are those different? Do they blend well?
So with Jennifer Strange, it was a contemporary map. So I literally just looked at Google Maps and drew Savannah. So it was like so fast, I was done. But when I work with an author, that's mostly what I want to talk about, because it's so interesting what goes through my mind when I get commissioned for a piece of art. And I'm like, okay, sometimes I work with people who know exactly what they want to a T. I just worked with Jonathan Mayberry on his map, and he basically drew the whole map for me. He was like, it's already, this is it. This is the way I want it. It's the way I want it to look. So I just used that, literally interpreted that, and then made a border. And then I've worked with clients who have no idea. They're like, this is what my world is. They send me a list of cities. They send me a list of topographically what's happening. Sometimes we'll get in a call and talk about what things look like, and I'll send a sketch and say, is any of this wrong? But the biggest thing I consider is line weight, because the line weight between a mountain, a river, and coast of the land has to be different from each other, so you can tell the difference. They can't all be the exact same line weight, or it just looks monotonous. You can't really tell what's the river, what's a town, so a lot goes into how do I indicate, depending on how close we are to the map or how far away, what type of line am I using? How am I showing mountains? How am I showing trees? Are the trees going to be really detailed, or are they going to be really small and just look like a general iconic representation of a tree? When I worked on a video game, I've worked on it just got Kickstarter funded, Romansylvania. That was the fastest map I've ever done. I did it in 2 hours, just sitting there. I yanked the whole thing because my boss, Bill Gardner, knew exactly what he wanted. He's like, this is what I want to see. And he had kind of a sketch. And so I just inked the whole thing because all he wanted was black and white. So that just was, the process was simple. But say you're an author and you want to do a giveaway of your map, then that means what I have to create is a black and white for the inside of your book and a full color for a giveaway poster. And those two are not the same size. The inner dimensions of a book are not the poster dimensions at a printer. So I have to come up with 2 different maps and make sure that my design is flexible. So it can't be flat. The layers all have to move. So I primarily work digitally, because when I've worked traditionally, I made the mistake of putting the border on the same layer as the main land. And so it couldn't flex to the giveaway poster size, which is much bigger. Like, it's much taller, I'd say, in the height. And it was a whole disaster. I had to redo the whole map. So there's a lot of thought process that goes into it that now I'm just very fast at, because I've done it for 5-6 years at this point. So yeah, usually I let the author guide me in what they want, because I want to make their dream come true. They've worked so hard in this book that I just want to give them something special. So we talk a lot about the story, and the Easter egg thing is always in the border or in little details of the map. And I'm like, what are some cool elements? So I'm working on the middle grade horror right now, and we're talking about what spooky elements can we bring out into the border of the map. And so we put kind of like this little cat and this sailboat that's spooky, and we just bring out these things that later make sense, but they won't until you read it. That's the most fun part of my job, is finding things that make it special.
Perfect. Jeannie.
Wow. And the question was what tools I use, right?
How do you start? Yes.
How I start. I got so lost in the details. That was fascinating. Well, for better or worse, the story usually starts before anything else. And then because until that point, I don't know what I don't know. And I've got to kind of understand, like, I have a series that's like the one back here, Witch's Walk. It's a completely imaginary town in the northern corner of northeastern corner of Massachusetts. And completely made up, sort of like what Susan was talking about. Right on the literal map, it's swamp. So I made it not swamp and created a town there. And so with that, I actually started with the town square, because the prologue to the story, and yes, I know most people don't like prologues, but the prologues to the story starts in 1691. So the only thing that's there is the town square, and that had to remain the same in 1691 and in present day. So I started with that, and I don't do it on the computer because, like Susan said, it's a lot easier to erase on the paper and add and flex and do things until you sort of get the idea of what you want to do, especially in those first stages. It's all pencil and T-square and, you know, S curves until I can sort of get it down in my head. And that series is, I'm about 7 books into that one. So the town is pretty much set now. I probably could, you know, give the maps to Kat and have her figure out how to make them look pretty so I could give them away. That's a great idea, by the way. Stealing that. But yeah, I start with the story idea, and then we go to pencil and lots of erasing. Lots of erasing.
No.
And when you're working with someone else, like Nancy and I have worked on several stories together, and then working with these 7 people on Caneham Castle, lots of erasing. Wait, no, we can't put that there. It has to be over here because I said there was this and this between that. And but that makes it fun too. So
Now with Witch's Walk, that's kind of interesting. The fact you had to start it in the 1600s and then present day. Did you do 2 maps, just keeping the town square, or were there other aspects you kept throughout time?
Yes, I did. I have 1 map from 1691, and then I literally copied that and added to it for present day, because that's the one thing that has to stay the same. But yeah, I did 2 maps because my brain doesn't accept that otherwise. Wait, I have to go back to the 1691 map now because I can't look at this one and go, yeah, that was there in 1691.
I was just thinking, because there's obviously been improvements since then. And yeah, so Tina.
Lines for one thing.
Exactly. Tina, what do you do to start your process?
Well, I mean, I do draw, and, you know, I'm not a fabulous artist, but I do draw, and I have done some architectural drawing. And so, like I said, and I love maps because this is historically, that's really important to me. So I draw everything now that I have directions. I make sure everything's noted. But the other tools that I use is that I have an artist like Kat. Soraya Corcoran did both of my maps for me. And brilliantly, there is no fold issue because the map only appears on 1 page. So there is no crease. It is not something that's going to drive either Susan or Kat crazy. And this was very, you know, thoughtfully done for this reason. And she did also make me a black and white and a sepia. We did talk, we did have Easter eggs in it as well. There was a lot of back and forth. I had a good idea of what I wanted and the topography. And the first book actually doesn't have the map in it. So it is strictly a giveaway because that came after the book came out for a number of reasons. But the third book, particularly because the world expands so much, it really needed a map. But like Jeanne was mentioning, like I had to go and figure out some geographic and geological workarounds because of what I had said. And so I'm like, well, how can I make this actually work? And so my second layer is actually to try and make those map images and issues also kind of make geological sense. Like I have this narrowing in this, it's basically coming off of what Nora Jemison talks about in world building. You know, when you're building your world, there are sort of climatic considerations, there are geological changes. And so I'm like, I tried to incorporate that in this third map so that this actually would make geological sense. It's just as opposed to just being really pretty, which is awesome. But there are Easter eggs in mine as well. And those have to do with design, the lettering, and the things that are noted in various places. So Soraya was my great tool that I got to work with, and she's wonderful and very talented. And so I'm very grateful, but I sketch now everywhere. If there's a battle scene, I will sketch out where the troops are coming from, just to make sure that, like Jeanne said, I don't have to go back and read the whole book again to make sure that I didn't blow it because I didn't make a note of it.
All right. So we now know what maps do for you as the author / creators. And I'll start with you, Kat. What do you think maps do for the readers, or with games, the people playing the games?
So with games, there's nothing I reference more than where I am on a map, honestly, because especially if you're dealing with anything with a lot of back and forth and having to find items, that is part of what my job is on Romancevania, is to create the HUD, the heads up display, where you have your health bar, magic bar, but it's also the map, the little mini map where you navigate and you're like, where was that health thing I found, or where was that item, or how do I find my way back to where I was? And I think it's the same sort of thing with books. Like, you want to have something that enriches the world. It shows you kind of where you are. If it's a big quest and you want to remember where like different towns are, I think it gives you a sense of the world. It's a catch-22 though, because sometimes when you're writing a book, you as an author may want the reader to just imagine it and have like that balanced imagination of where things are and what they look like. And then when you give them something concrete, that's their image of it. So sometimes maps are really, really great. And then sometimes you don't want it with that particular book because you want them to just picture it, right? But I've found that most of the maps I work on always have some sort of quest where you need to know where things are. The only time I've had a map break that is the one I'm currently working on now, where it's an island where all the roads change. So I had to somehow imply through the roads and the trees that there are no roads. They just all change. And I figured out a workaround where I have all these trees and the roads just don't connect. You just see a road and there's some trees and there's a road, but they don't make sense. So that's how I worked around it. So some of this is really interesting. Like when I'm saying, oh yeah, it's about knowing where you are and where you've been and where you're going, then there's maps that totally break that rule. So I think it's a sense of delight, honestly, a sense of enriching the world. I mean, whenever I've worked on a campaign for swag and stuff and say, oh yeah, you want to check out this book, you want to pre-order it, it's always about enriching the world so that the reader's like, I'm excited about being in this world and buying this book and pre-ordering it. It's always about generating that enthusiasm for where you're going to go with these characters.
Jeannie?
I don't know. I think I know I, as a reader, get a lot of the things Kat was just mentioning. I get a sense of place and a sense of movement. There have been a couple series where it hasn't worked for me, where I, like Tina said, I'm going to be the kind of spoiler here. There's a couple big series, long-standing series, where I'm a map nerd. So on my third or fourth reread of this series, I followed along on the map, and the map is wrong. And so, oops. If you go from that country to that country, you don't go through that one. And so, and you know, the sense of time and place of how long it takes you to get from one country to another if you're on a quest is cool. You sometimes get the sense of that. And then sometimes it gets screwed up because you're looking at the map and going, but I think as a reader, for me, that's actually one of the reasons I started loving maps, is because some of my favorite stories had them and I could go follow along on the quest. And I don't game a whole lot, but my sons do. And I don't know what either one of them would do without a map. So, oh no, look, gotta see the map, Mom, it's cool. So yeah, I think readers get a lot out of it, and that sense of time and place. And also, as Kat said, just enriching the world with things that are Easter eggs, either for the book that the map is in, or the books that are to come. Because sometimes you look at a map on a book one that you know is a trilogy and you go, oh, wonder what that's about. And I just think that's super cool as a reader.
Tina?
It's a combination of things. I think there's multiple categories, but I think there's 3 large categories for readers in relationships to maps. There's the reader who the first thing they will do is go and find the map in the book. That's the first thing they're looking for. There's the other reader. Another category of reader is somebody who starts reading and then goes like, oh, where is that? And then goes and finds the map. And then I think there's a third category reader who's like, I don't care at all about the map. It's sort of like, I don't need this. My own imagination is so much better, and I'm just going to go for it. So often I actually fall into that last category, which I think is sort of my kind of bias against maps in my own books, because I don't actually have to travel that much in my world in the first book. But like I said, by the time you get to the third one, it's a big deal. But and I got slammed by some readers like, where's the map? Super angry, just like, 1-star review because there wasn't a map. And I thought, well, lesson learned. I'll just put the map in and y'all can just figure it out for yourselves, which way you want to go with that. So that was lesson learned. But they do enrich the journey if that's what you're into. My personal world is just to start to imagine that place in my head and go with it. And that works for me, doesn't work for everybody. And so to be as broadly inclusive, just put the map in and then everybody can be happy. But it should be accurate. You shouldn't be in a case like Jeanne where you're like following along. You're like, wait a second, that's not supposed to be there. There has to be some accuracy.
All right, Susan.
Well, touching on what Kat was talking about when it comes to gamers, as a gamer, I have spent most of my life playing RPGs. As a matter of fact, I played World of Warcraft up through expansion number, I think 6. It was Warlords of Draenor. So I watched the map expand as the game went on. And yes, in a gamer sense, you absolutely need a map, because otherwise you have no idea where you're going or what you're doing. And with those maps in particular, they're so pretty. Having the map it's functional, but it's also a piece of art, and it's exciting. That was always my favorite part of the new expansion, is what's the map going to look like? What's the world going to look like? And that kind of kept me going a long time. That's my favorite part of any video game that I start playing, is I immediately pull up the map and I like to explore and see what's going to pop up and all the different little things about it that you don't necessarily think about. But from the reader point of view, I like the maps in the books, but I typically don't look at them until after I've read the book, simply because I like to form my own conclusions. And if by chance I do come across something like Jeanne was talking about, where it's inaccurate, it's going to make me crazy. Luckily for me, none of my stuff requires that I have a map, because it's not large scale enough. My maps are more for me in making sure that the continuity in the description is there. Because readers now, they're going to pick up on any little discrepancy. If you're going down Main Street and you turn left to go get to the pet store in one book, if you turn right from that same direction to get to the pet store, they're going to call you on it, and you're never going to hear the end of it. So that's always in the back of my head. I need to make sure this is right, because somebody's going to see it if it's not. So I just started rambling and I totally lost my train of thought. So I'm going to stop talking now. Sorry.
Well, what you touched on, I think, at least in my mind, links into the next question, which is, what do you do to make the map come to life? And I say that because you're talking about gaming maps, and gaming maps at least the ones I've seen, tend to be more realistic. They deal with geography, they deal with all of that. And books where you don't need all of that, where you're, like you're saying, turning right to go to the pet store or left, you know, you can leave some of that stuff out. So I'm going to start with you, Jeannie. What do you do to make your map seem real?
Well, so far that, because I'm not designing games, thank goodness, that hasn't been as necessary for me in terms of readership, because the maps are not in the book. Those are for, as Susan said, there's more for me to make sure I have continuity and all that sort of thing. I did have that challenge, however, in 2 different anthologies that I was in where the maps were, I had drawn floor plans in one anthology with 4 authors, and one of the New York Times bestseller folks who was in it emails me and said, where are these maps online? Where's this building? Where are these maps online? Because I had shot pictures of, it's on a corner in DC at the corner of K and 16th. Well, at the time that I designed the map, there was a big hole there. They were building an office building or something. So I basically stood on the corner and shot pictures always so that you would know when you're looking, when your killer is looking out the windows of the hotel, what do they see? And how far away is the White House, which you can see. So that was the whole premise of the story. And so she emails me, she's, I can't find this hotel online anywhere. Where are these floor plans coming from? Why can't I pull them up? And I'm like, because I drew them. And it's not real. So obviously I did a little better job than I thought I had. With keeping my line straight, because she actually thought they were real floor plans. But I've never had to make sure that it was 3-dimensional and real or creative like Kat does for other people. So it's only been in trying to keep everybody kind of herded into the building in the same way. So I'm probably not the best one to answer that question.
How about you, Tina?
Well, comes up more in working with Soraya, because she's really the one who's bringing the artwork to life. In my own sketches, you know, like they're stick figures. But to bring it to life, it is to create continuity between the world building that's happening in the book and then what's being presented in terms of art for the maps. And so that includes the typography to make sure that that kind of goes in line. This is very loosely based on sort of the nomadic tribes that are up in nomadic communities in Scandinavia and in a kind of Iron Age world. So to try and make sure that there's some reference in the artwork that to the architecture, what the buildings may look like, to the typography, to the types of trees that are involved. Are they pine? Are they oak? So that there is a sense from the map itself through the artwork of the things that you're mentioning in the book. And so because I'm talking about largely pine and large, it's mostly these very dense forests. And so we had conversations about, well, how dense? What type of tree? What does the architecture look like? You know, and I have navigation based, you know, star navigation, but not based upon sort of, you know, our sense of navigation. So they have different symbols. So she's also incorporated those symbols to kind of bring that to life. So when I'm talking about he follows the goose, there is the star constellation that is the goose. So those are the type of details that Soraya was able to bring to life, because mine are just be stick figures. So thankful, so thankful for the artists in this world.
All right, perfect. Susan, I know most of yours are for yourself, but do you add stuff to make them real for you?
As a procrastination tool, absolutely. Again, my maps don't ever actually end up in my books because mine are not, I'm not writing, well, I say that I do have a series that's probably going to end up with maps in it now because I am a glutton for punishment. But for the most part, my stuff is not large scale enough to warrant a map. It's more me getting around town or making sure that fight scenes are working out the right way, or that there's enough room to do what I need to do within the confines of the story. Again, I've got a series that I'm working on now that will more than likely have maps in it because it's dark fantasy and it takes place in an alternate reality. And let me put it this way. My world Bible for this 4-book series is about 200 pages already. And I've not even finished the first book completely yet. Because there's that much going on. Most of which will never actually make it into the story because, again, squirrel brain, and I have to know it so I can choose whether to use it or not.
Yeah.
I tend to, again, procrastinate and add a whole bunch of details that aren't necessarily the type of thing you would normally see on a map. I have a bad habit of when I've got a map of a city laid out, I've got names for all the businesses and who runs it, and I have character maps as well of who's related to who and how they know each other. And again, small towns, Southern intrigue, everybody knows everybody else, and you have to know all these things to make it make sense. So again, I'm not one that makes them real for public consumption, but more for me.
But that makes it easier for you as a writer to make your writing real.
Theoretically.
Okay. All right. Kat, how about you?
Well, this is going to be a really short, but I stare at things a lot. I'm serious. That's how I make things more real. I stare at them. I ask for references. I ask for 2 references. One, what does it look like in real life where you're describing, even if it's fantasy, what kind of swamp? What kind of trees? Why are they next to this type of mountain, so I have to know something like Tina was mentioning about actual nature, which means I have to look at it, stare at it, study it, Google it, Google Earth, like look at Google Maps and just really notice it with the science part of my brain, not the art part of my brain. I was studying this book about how we draw better, like how do you draw better? And it is when you look at an object, you use the science part, assessing how tall, how wide, the like engineering measurements of an object to draw it, how light and shadow hits it. That's how I work on making it more realistic. But then the art side comes in of what are your favorite fantasy maps? If you were to pick 3 of your favorite books and your favorite maps, what did they look like? What does the style look like? And what do you like about that type of line work, that type of art? Do you like that it's like the Shadow and Bone map by Leigh Bardugo? It has creatures in it. Do you want creatures in it? Is that going to enrich your world for your readers? And then from there, it's just adding flair to it. But all of it is from that science engineer part of my brain where I think with me, I have a hodgepodge of knowledge. I took engineering in high school. I went to math science high school. That was what we did. We had like a robotics team and chess club. There was no football. So I was doing CAD when I was in high school. I learned After Effects by studying it. And I did animation for Cartoon Network. And I did that for a while. So when I got to Unreal Engine and my video game, it was like, oh, this is easy to figure out how to take the 3D space and turn it flat. I already had a lot of experience with what 3D looks like and how it should translate to something you navigate as a user. I kind of just fell into video games. They found me and said, come work for us. Because I was talking about maps on a panel. So I had no idea that all this would translate to video games. I just fell into it. I've been there 2 years now, and absolutely love it. And it's all these weird things I know how to do that go into the video game: After Effects, drawing maps, writing. It's a whole bunch of different skills, but making it more real, making it more alive. A lot of that comes from the writer. And what is your story? What's the most important parts? And how can I translate them? And then staring at things a lot, staring at the type of tree you want, staring at the type of mountains you want, and making sure it looks like that.
All right, perfect. So my next question is, and I'm going with you, Tina, partly because you're next, but partly because you've already given me an answer to this, and I want to see if I can get another answer from you. Is there anything you wish you had known when you started out about using maps, and any tips you have for someone that is starting out now? And you've already told us, just do the map.
Do the map. Do it. Bite the bullet. Do the map. Oh God. If I could go back to that 10-year ago me and just say, just do the map. It would make everybody been so much happier. What would I say to somebody who's going to do this? Do it as detailed as you possibly can. Get as much information out, so that you don't have to keep going back. If there's a lot of questions you have to ask, and maybe there's we should write down a whole list of questions that you should be asking yourself. But I ended up having to ask questions like, how fast does a horse travel? How fast do humans walk? Distances, geography. There are all these, even in a fantasy world, yes, physics still apply, science still applies. So you need to incorporate this. And, if somebody's looking at world building, Nora Jemison, I've said this before, but she has, I think, on her website, kind of an introductory free kind of how to world build. And once you start looking at that, that also helps you think about, how do you want your maps? Where are the houses going to be? What kind of houses? Do people live above ground, below ground? So those start to really impact how the map looks. And so I think it depends on, some of it depends on how you are as a writer. I'm not a world builder. That's not necessarily my jam. My jam is about the emotional characters. That's where I'm really that's where I want to get at. And some people love to world build, and I am in awe of them because I just accidentally created this world with some foresight and some, methodology. But I was more interested in getting into the lives of my characters and getting into that sort of inner mapping. But the more you world build, the more that helps your maps, kind of develop kind of naturally, because you have to answer these questions. So that's what I would say to somebody who's starting out. If you're a world builder, use that information to create your maps and do it as soon as you possibly can.
Susan.
I would tell them the same thing I would tell myself if I could go back to the start. Don't be afraid to screw it up.
Okay.
I went a long time not drawing out maps for myself because I was always afraid that I was going to screw it up and it was going to be too hard to redo it. No, when you're working on the book, the map itself is a living, breathing thing, and it's going to change as you discover more about your place, about your people, the history behind it, and it's going to grow, it's going to change. Again, write in pencil because erase is a lot easier. If you're using a computer program, work in layers. Absolutely work in layers. That way you can move things around as you need to. You don't have to work.
Yeah, because
I'm nodding as hard as I can. Layers.
Because if you get everything on one layer and you go, oh wait, I need to move this to here, yeah, then you have to erase and rebuild or copy and paste. It's a headache. But yes, graph paper is a wonderful thing because it does help you keep straight lines up and down and side to side. Even if you are using a ruler or, as Jeannie said, a T-square, you don't always get it perfectly straight, and those lines help. Plus, they're really easy to get rid of if you scan it in later. But yeah, don't be afraid of the map. You can't screw it up because it's coming out of your head, and if you do, get a new piece of paper and start over. It's not that big a deal. It really isn't.
All right. Kat?
So I think my biggest piece of advice touches on what we were talking about earlier, which is the accuracy of the map. Every time I hear that the map isn't accurate, I wonder when in the process that illustrator got hired. Because I've had authors ask me, can I hire you to draw my map to pitch it? And I always refuse. And the reason I always refuse is because if you're pitching it to a small press, big press, or you want to self-publish it, you don't need a map until your book's basically done. And the reason is because accuracy. So don't hire someone like me or the wonderful illustrators they work with until you're done. Like say you're at a small press or a big press, you have to go through acquiring, editing it a couple rounds, and then you're ready to hire me. Then is when. Or if you're self-publishing it, make sure you've edited it a couple times, because otherwise I'm going to have to redraw the map again and have to charge you twice. Or you might end up going to print with a map that's not accurate, and then your readers will get upset. So my biggest piece of advice is, if you're thinking of doing a map, don't be afraid. Like Susan said, just draw it. It's okay. You can mess up. That's what erasers are for. I mess up on maps all the time, and I do this for a living. Everybody messes up on maps. Don't be afraid. Just jot down your stick figures, anything you want. Like I always draw a basic map too. And I can do the real thing, but I always do just a basic sketch that looks like nothing, because I need to know where things are, just like the writer does. So don't hire an illustrator until you're about to go to print. That's when you should do it. That's my big, please do this rule.
All right, perfect. And Jeannie.
Oh gosh, I just second everything everybody said. It's like, even if it's stick figures, even if it's circles that say swamp here, land here, crops here, houses here, even that little sketchy bit can keep you from losing your brain later. And if you're a map nerd, like all of us obviously are, and you use it as a distraction tool, guess what? That also ends up making your story better. So don't be afraid of that either. But mostly I just say, yeah, what they said.
All right, perfect. So that's going to do it for us tonight. But before we leave, I do want to go around the room again and let people know where they can find you on the internet. And I'll start with you, Susan.
I am usually on Facebook on any given day, wasting time and pretending to work. It's under my name, Susan Roddey. I can also be found, I've got 2 different websites. My dark fantasy and horror is shroddey.com. The romance stuff is siobhankincaid.com. And I've got pretty much everything in between can be found either by accessing Facebook or one of those websites.
All right, perfect. Kat?
So most of my handles are the same. Kat M as in Moon Scully. At Instagram, Twitter, my website's katherinescully.com. But I'm about to launch an art website. There'll be katscullyart.com. I already have an Instagram set up that's Kat Scully Art, and what's going to be on there is all my maps. And I'm doing a children's book illustration class. It's going to have all of my children's picture book art as well. So it's going to basically be my kidlit website. So katherinescully.com will become my author, horror, scary art website. So I'll have 2 different things. I have 2 different looks. So if you just Google Kat Scully, you'll find me. I'm around and I'm very friendly, so you can always say hi.
All right, perfect. Jeannie.
And you can find me at jeanneadams.com. I spend way too much time on Twitter. You can find me on Facebook, and you can find me here at ConTinual.
All right. And finally, Tina.
The easiest way, or the links are all on my website, LeCountMyers.com. It also has links to the maps that weren't included in the first book for all those people who were so right that I should have included the map in the first book, as well as you can read some snippets from any of the books. I think they're now all up there. So LeCountMyers.com. And I'm on Twitter, not that much anymore, but mostly on Instagram. And come see pictures of my cats on Instagram. It's pretty friendly. Flowers and cats.
All right, perfect. And I do want to thank all of you, and I want to thank everyone for watching. See you next time. Bye.